It's okay. All right. So again, you've all got tests, Form B, C, D, and E. I'm going to say some things about the articles as I go through. So it'd be a good idea to have your text out. And as I go, you're free to ask me questions about it. Now, if you're going, you can ask me questions about the test as well. Now, here's what you may not do. You may not ask me, what is the answer to number 1 on Form B? Okay. You can ask me questions if you're having some questions about the questions and about the text and all that. And so, if you learn to ask questions properly, it'll be helpful for you, I imagine. So we'll see. All right. So we got through paragraph 5, I believe it was, as a group. We talked about the search for meaning is successful. It not only makes you happy, but gives you the capacity to cope with suffering. What happens if one's groping for meaning in life has been in vain? This results in a fatal condition, which he called a give-up-itis. And he gives us an example of a concentration camp prisoner, and not just one specifically, but he said it was kind of like a pattern that you would see with people, where they would exhibit certain character traits when they had given up on trying to survive. And so the point, of course, there being that these are patterns that we see in people's lives, in lots of people's lives. Because again, very few people are individuals. We're part of a group, and so therefore we behave like members of a group. And so when you see a person who behaves, so when you see a person's behavior, it's a good point of reference to say, well, 90% of people behave this way before this happens, so that's probably where this is going to go. Now, there's always that person who's like, yeah, but you don't know that that's what they're going to do. Yeah, we can find out afterwards. But the good money is on people following patterns. People are generally patterns. This is why we're generally able to kind of boil people down to personality traits. Oh, you're this kind of a personality, or you're that kind of a personality. Now, of course, the more individual a person is, the more difficult it is to nail them down that way. But again, how many people actually take the time to become that individual? Not just say that they are, but actually take the time to analyze themselves and to know those things, and then to modify behavior in these ways. So he talks about people who tend to give up. He says, this is the pattern that we see in lives. In paragraph 6, he says, this is reminiscent of another parallel that confronts us day by day. I think of those youngsters who call themselves the no future generation. So the idea that we have no future is not something that's specific to generations right now, where we're saying, oh my God, the world's going to end, and the polar caps are going to melt, and the polar bears are going to take over. And it's not something that's specific to us today. It's something that's been going on for quite a while. Most generations think that they have no future. Why is that? Because we don't know what the hell's next. We're trying to figure out the world as we go. And when the future is uncertain, what do we populate the darkness with when we're little kids?
Nightlight.
What's that?
Nightlight.
Nightlight. Well, no, I'm saying what do we populate the darkness with? What's in the dark when we're little kids? Monsters. And so when we're younger, we're looking out at a future that's uncertain, because the future is always uncertain. What do we populate the future with? Well, monsters, disasters. I was looking. I'm old enough to remember that the world was going to end with killer bees. That was a huge thing in the 80s, I think it was, where killer bees were going to they had these big masses of these bees that were coming up from Africa that were way more hostile than just normal honeybees. They would go in, they would swarm and attack people. And so the whole thing was like, oh my, and there are actually movies about the killer bees that were coming. They were going to destroy all life in North America. It didn't happen. We look back to the 70s, and you can look these up in newspapers. There were all these predictions about the coming ice age. And the idea was the world was getting cooler, it was going to freeze over, and that we were all going to freeze to death from an ice age. Well, then you fast forward, and we have, and by the way, this whole time this is happening, we have this terror of nuclear war that's going to kill us all. And then we get into the 90s, and we have global warming. And it's like, oh my God, the world's getting warmer. Forget the whole ice age now. Things are going to melt, and then all these cities are going to be underwater. And then it turns out that the climate predictions aren't exactly what we thought they would be, because we were supposed to have some significant problems by 2012. It didn't happen. I'm sorry, by 2010, it didn't happen. So then it becomes climate change. Well, it's the overall climate that's changing, and so we have all these terrors that we're always facing, because the future is uncertain. We don't know what it's going to look like. And so we tend to populate it with the worst possible circumstance. Now again, there's value in that, because that gives us something to fight against. It gives us a monster to battle against. Imagine if I told you, hey, man, the future's going to be no problems at all. Really? Yeah, there's no problems at all. Everything's going to be great. oh, that sounds good, until it happens. You know, I even think about my generation. The Soviet Union had been defeated, so now the United States was the only superpower in the world, and we were economically, we were kicking butt. There was nobody to stand against us militarily. We were the cultural empire of the world, and so what did we do? Well, we complained about it, and we ended up, wearing flannel and Doc Martens and buying $4 cups of coffee, and we created grunge rock. And then you've got Kurt Cobain, who can tell you all about. Well, he can't tell you all about that anymore, but you get the idea. In other words, we complained about commercialism. And the idea was we're so successful and we're so rich. Man, we hate being rich. In other words, we're going to create some kind of a monster to fight against. And so, to keep this in mind when we're talking about how we have no future and how everything's messed up, every generation seems to think this way. And maybe it's good. Maybe it keeps us on our toes. It gives us something to do. But in paragraph 7, he refers to it as the drug scene. That's a general mass phenomenon. So namely the feeling of meaninglessness, which results from frustration of our existential needs, which in turn has become a universal phenomenon of industrial societies, which we talked about. He sees this as being a problem of industrial society. And why? Well, because in industrial society, we've defeated most of the problems. You follow? In other words, we're no longer starving. We're able to actually stand up against the environment. We can create air conditioning and heating systems, so we can live wherever we want to live. We have enough food. We have enough clothing. And so what does that do? It gives us a whole heck of a lot of time to think about stuff. Like I was just saying about in the 90s, that we had so much material wealth and we had so much comfort that we now had time to think about how much we hated those things. Because those are the things that essentially took away our struggle. So we have to find something to struggle against, because there's something that's hardwired into the human mind that we have to do that. We have to overcome stuff. We can't be stagnant. If I gave you, $100 million and you think about the kinds of things that you would do with it, you'd get bored with it pretty quickly. And this is why when you find people who have created companies and they've earned $100 million, what do? Well, they keep working. And a lot of us think like, man, if I had that money, I would just retire. Maybe. But the kind of personality it takes to start something that ends up earning that kind of money is the kind of personality that can't just sit by and do nothing. And so it's worth considering in our own lives. If we can find ourselves in a situation where we're totally okay with just like spacing off and not doing stuff, and I'll beat the heck out of it in class, putting our head down and doing nothing. If you're okay with doing nothing, then it's worth considering whether or not you're the kind of personality who could achieve something like that. Because if you could, you're on a mission. You don't have time to do stuff like that. What can I do in class? Well, you can think about stuff. You can plan stuff. Even if you're not paying attention to what's going on here, there's still a million other things that can occupy our heads with, rather than, the grain finish on a desk. Or even better yet, what's a better thing to do? Don't come. Do you really have to go to class every day to pass? Right? Whatever, man. And if you don't want to be someplace, there's a really good solution to that. Don't be there. It's no hard feelings. Be someplace where you're actually going to get something out of it, and then that way you're getting something out of it. And so he continues on paragraph 8. As the causation of the feeling of meaninglessness, one may say that people have enough to live by. That's important, but nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. We should absolutely have identified that as an important phrase. That we have something to live by, but nothing to live for. We have the means, we have the money, but we don't have the meaning for things. To be sure, some do not even have the means. And to be sure, some people don't even have that. So if you're thinking like, well, what about me? I'm poor. In particular, I think of the mass of people who are today unemployed. 50 years ago, I published a study. Gosh, how old this guy is. 50 years ago, I published a study devoted to a specific type of depression I had diagnosed in cases of young patients suffering from what I called unemployment neurosis. And I could show that this neurosis really originated in a twofold erroneous identification. Being jobless, so being unemployed, was equated with being useless. And being useless was equated with having a meaningless life. So we're talking about why it is that's important to have a job of some kind. I mean, a job, any job. If you're finding yourself depressed, just get a job. What job? Any job. What if you think the job is below you? Doesn't matter. Having a job that's below you is better than having no job, which should be way below you if a certain type of job is below you. You know? And even then, to think that a certain type of job is below you, man, that's horrible thinking. I was just thinking that you've seen the protests or the marches or whatever you want to call them that the teachers are kind of instigating students to do. And there was I think it was Eastlake High School, I saw some students had these signs, and they were like supporting the teachers, and the one kid had a big old smile on his face, and his poster said, I don't want to work at McDonald's. And I'm thinking, God, what an arrogant little shit. You know, I'm too good to work at McDonald's. And I'm looking at this kid, and I'm just like, dude, what skill set do you possibly have right now that you would think that you're above something like that, you know? And that completely puts down, of course, the hundreds of thousands of people who work at a McDonald's, or the hundreds of thousands of people who work at fast food places. That you've got this dude in Eastlake, I don't even know what his GPA is or what his intellectual skill set is or anything like that. But the idea that you would make something like that to put down people and say, essentially, I don't want to have to do that. Ugh. You know, if you don't think that there's a problem with too much material comfort, then you need to consider that situation. You know, it reminds me of several years ago. It's probably my third year as a teacher. I refer to that as my strange year. It was the year I actually quit and came back the next year, quit mid-year. And I gave back essays I had graded. And attached to all the essays that had Fs, I had stapled applications to like KFC, Carl's Jr., and McDonald's. Funny, whatever. And so it was actually very funny that I'll let you to wonder about this and who the groups were. But there was one specific, and I put out the applications as well. And I said, oh, by the way, even if you didn't fail, I've got applications for you if that's what you're aiming at in life. And there was one group of students who were very pissy about that. Like, tore it off and threw it in the trash. Like, it got very. And then there's another group of students who came up and they're like, can we get those applications? And I'm like, yeah, guys, go for it. And these kids all went over and they all started like pulling all those applications, you know? And all those kids had something in common. It was interesting. I can tell you, but you know, I won't tell you, but I'll let you to wonder at that. But it was interesting. You had this one group, and by the way, both groups, I'll say this much, both groups were recent immigrant groups. I'll tell you that much about it. And then the one group, which just kind of looked at that stuff and thought, I'm better than that. That's blah. That's not even funny, Scanlon. Then you got the other group that didn't take it to be a joke at all. They took it to be an opportunity. You know, because they understood something that made me actually step back and go, God, what a jerk move that was. You know, not just because it was something to our students, but also because, like I've told you, my dad worked at McDonald's his whole life. And so he took those jobs because they were opportunities to, you know, for providing either stepping stones to something else, or an opportunity to learn some skill sets, or an opportunity to get some money to help out, to provide for people, whatever it is. And so the important thing here is to get a job, any job, because if you don't have a job, we think that we're meaningless. I'm sorry, we're useless. I don't have a use. I'm just sitting around doing nothing. And if I don't have a use, then that means that my life is meaningless. And so he goes on to explain that a way that you can solve that problem for people when they're unemployed is you can help them to volunteer somewhere, because then they're doing some kind of work. At least they have use. And if they have, in other words, the use may not be to provide for people, but the use is to serve people and to help people. And so that gives you an opportunity that's what I'm thinking of, to become better, to better the world. How about that? To make the world a better place. And there's use and there's meaning in that. So, questions so far? All right, take a look at the next page, starting with paragraph 9.